thank you very much to Giuli for inviting me, to all the departments who have made this possible, and to the Center for Ideas and Society. I have to say that when I heard the name of the center, I thought it was so cool. I also wanted to, I see that there are a lot of undergraduate students here in the audience, and I want to make sure that you understand this talk, because this is mostly for you. And so if there are any questions, or if I'm going too fast, please feel free to ask, okay? I think that most everybody who's, before I forget, I would like to acknowledge all my collaborators and the research support that I've received from the National Institutes of Health and the National Science Foundation to conduct this work. All right, so I think that most people who are sitting in this room right now have probably tried at some point in their lives to learn a second language. And perhaps the experience that most people have is that the native language, so your L1, influences or kind of seeps through when you are trying to speak or learn a second language. So you are trying to say, you are learning, you are a native speaker of Spanish, you are trying to learn English, you want to say the word apple, and the word manzana is right there, active, and almost wants to come out. And so what we know is that when bilinguals read, when bilinguals listen to language, when bilinguals are getting ready to speak, the two languages are actually active and influence one another. And I'll give you an example with cognates. So cognates are words that look similar in form, so in orthography, and also have similar meaning. So for example, in Spanish and English, a cognate word is the word piano in Spanish and piano in English. And so we know that two languages are active and compete with one another, because when we ask bilinguals to name words like piano in one of their two languages, they are faster naming cognates than they are naming non-cognate words like chair. And so the only reason why, or the reason that we think they are faster naming these cognates, is because cognates are activated in the two languages and make the decision faster, and so there is facilitation. And so this is some of the evidence, this is some of the methods that are taken to understand how it is, or to figure out how it is that the two languages are active and influence one another. So we also know, so one important insight from a very vast amount of work over the past perhaps 40 years of research on second language acquisition, is that prolonged naturalistic exposure to the second language can have profound effects on how it is that the second language is processed, reversing many times that influence that people most sometimes feel from the first language into the second language, and even causing bilinguals or second language speakers to become highly proficient in the second language. So we know that exposure to a second language can make you better in that second language. So if this is the case, and if we know that the two languages of a bilingual speaker are active all the time, even when the intention is to speak only one language, one important aspect of the comparison between L2 and L1 speakers is to consider how knowledge of a second language influences the first language. So the question is not only how does your L1 influence your L2, but given that the two languages are always active, how does your second language influence your first language? And one important question is, why is this question not being looked at? How come most of the research has looked at the influence of the L2 on the L1 and not vice versa? And one potential explanation is that the story so far has been that there is a decline in the ability to learn a second language. So the traditional story has been that after a certain period during adolescence, and once the brain has lateralized, learning a second language is very difficult. And so if it's very difficult after a certain a particular age, then we really don't expect not only not to become proficient in the second language, you certainly would not expect your first language to change, right, given these assumptions. But we now know that the idea that there is a critical period in which after that period it is very difficult or almost impossible to learn a second language is actually not true. It's actually mythology. And so what we actually know and what I'm going to be talking about and the research that I will be showing you today will try to illustrate that proficient bilinguals may not be two monolinguals in one brain, and that they may not be like native speakers in their native language once they've learned a second language, suggesting that the native language and the entire cognitive system is actually open to influence from the second language. All right, so the outline of the talk is as follows. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the research that we have been conducting in my lab for the past 10, 11 years, looking at the effect of the second language on processing the first language. And we will be looking at immersion experience, so how it is that being immersed in a second language influences the first language, looking at two particular types of grammatical constructions, relative clauses and grammatical gender, which I will explain in a minute. So if you don't understand the terminology, don't worry about it. Whereas these are real-life experiments, I will be also talking about a simulated immersion experiment in a lab to try to understand how quickly we can come to change the native language. And then I'm going to be looking at a little bit of evidence also coming from our lab, showing that how it is that speakers tune to their linguistic environment using, and I'll be doing this using code switching data. And then I'll be talking about some concluding remarks. So to start the first experiment, so the overarching question here is, what is the effect of prolonged exposure to a second language on the first language system, and particularly on how it is that speakers resolve what we call syntactic ambiguities. So let me give you an example of what a syntactic ambiguity is. In Spanish and English, this particular sentence, Anthony congratulated the daughter of the salesman who went to Paris, has exactly the same word order in Spanish and in English. But interestingly, the interpretation of the sentence is not the same. So let me just explain to you why. So the sentence is composed of two nouns, which we're going to call a complex noun phrase. So you have the noun daughter and another word salesman. And then you have what linguists call a relative clause. So that word there, that pair of words there. And so if you ask native Spanish speakers the equivalent sentence in Spanish and you say, who went to Paris, most native Spanish speakers will say the daughter. Okay, so the first noun. And we're going to call this the high noun. High in the position because it's farther away from the relative clause. So that's the high noun, and the low noun is the noun that is closest to the relative clause. So native Spanish speakers, when asked who went to Paris, most of the time will say the daughter. Native English speakers will say the salesman. So although the sentence is identical in word order in the two languages, the interpretation of who went to Paris, which is what we call the ambiguous relative clause, varies cross-linguistically. So something that we really wanted to know was, well, how does a Spanish-English bilingual resolve this particular type of ambiguity in their first language? So if you are a second language speaker of English and you are very proficient in your second language, does that affect the way in which you process this equivalent sentence in Spanish? So that's the question of the first study. And so what we did was recruit L1 Spanish speakers. These were all native speakers of Spanish who had learned Spanish at home in a Spanish-speaking country. So they were all adult L1 speakers of Spanish who learned English as adults, most of them in the United States. And they had lived in an English-speaking environment for approximately 7 years. And so remember that what we're testing them is not in English, but in Spanish, which is their first language. And so we gave them sentences similar to the ones that I showed you a little while ago, but in Spanish with the same type of structure. So Manuel located the friend, feminine in Spanish, of the hairdresser who was Greek, masculine, of origin. So what's important about Spanish is that nouns like amiga, friend, have to agree in gender with adjectives like Greek or griego. And so what we see here is that because peluquero, hairdresser, is masculine, the only way to interpret correctly this adjective, if you are a person that typically interprets these adjectives referring to that noun, would be to link these two together. All right, so what we say here is that these sentences are disambiguated in favor of low attachment because the only interpretation that is correct is one in which Greek, which is masculine, refers to peluquero, which is masculine. Now, the high attachment sentence, on the other hand, to create those sentences, what we did was invert the gender of these nouns, all right? And we kept this area the same. And so here we have amigo, which is masculine, we have peluquera, which is feminine, and we have Greek, which is masculine. So the only way this sentence can be correctly processed in Spanish is if you interpret the word Greek, which is masculine, as referring to friend, which is also masculine. And so if you are a native Spanish speaker, this sentence should cause no difficulties because this is typically what Spanish speakers like to do. Whereas if you are a native Spanish speaker, this sentence should cause some difficulty because as you are reading through it, you believe that this sentence is going to be about the friend, and as it turns out, the correct interpretation is one in which this adjective refers to hairdresser. So that sentence should be hard for native Spanish speakers because it forces them to do something that they are not used to doing. That sentence should be easy. And how did we collect the data? We brought participants in the lab, and we we tracked their eye movements while they were reading the sentences on the computer screen, and then we looked at fixation durations on this word, on the word that tells us how they are interpreting the sentence. And basically, this is what we found. We collected a group of native Spanish speakers in Spain, and then we collected a group of bilinguals who were L1 Spanish, L2 English bilinguals who were matched in proficiency with the bilinguals that we ran also here in the US. So these bilinguals in Spain were bilinguals who really were not exposed to English. They had just learned English as a second language, but they lived in Spain. These are the monolinguals living in Spain also. And here, and we also collected a group of bilinguals who were L1 Spanish, L2 English, but who were living here in the US. The light bar represents fixation durations on the preferred strategy that Spanish speakers use, and so high attachment, whereas the black bar represents low attachment. And what you find is that monolingual Spanish speakers do exactly what they're supposed to do when they read sentences in which the disambiguation matches what they expect to see. They're easy to read. If it doesn't match, it takes them longer. The bilinguals in Spain do exactly the same thing. But the bilinguals in the US don't. So for the bilinguals in the US, reading Spanish sentences that favor high attachment becomes difficult. And in fact, but the sentences that favor low attachment are easy, indicating that, in fact, they have somehow, being exposed to this environment has somehow switched the way in which they process a language that they had been speaking for 23 years before they came here. All right, so although the finding was interesting, the truth is that the particular structure that we used is a structure that can vary in how people interpret the structure, depending on a whole bunch of contextual factors. So we decided to ask, put this idea of the L2 influencing the L1 on a bit of a more stringent type of test. So we wanted to see whether, in fact, we could find other structures in which being exposed to a particular type of linguistic environment would change the L1. And what we looked at is grammatical gender processing. So Spanish has, words in Spanish have gender, and it's called grammatical gender. And and this grammatical gender is reflected in articles and in nouns and in adjectives. And so the word la here is feminine, pelota is also feminine, and galleta is also feminine. And what research has found is that native speakers of Spanish, and also children who are native speakers of Spanish, use grammatical gender information encoded in articles to predict or to anticipate what the gender of the following noun, because gender has to agree between the articles and the nouns. And so if I show, experiments have shown children and adults this type of display, display with a picture of a ball, pelota, which is feminine, and a cookie, galleta, which is also feminine. And kids have had to hear the question, find the, encuéntrala. When children and adults hear this fragment, typically what happens is their eye movements are recorded so that people can see where the eye looks at first. Okay, so where it is that people are anticipating, the speaker will tell them to find. Well, that was a totally ungrammatical sentence. Let me say that all over again. And so that was okay in Spanish, but not in English. All right. And so given this particular display, people try to record speakers' eye movements to see whether the speakers can anticipate, the hearers can anticipate where the speaker will tell them to look. So if I say encuéntrala, the expectation would be that because this is feminine and this is also feminine, I could just look at these two words back and forth until I actually hear what it is that I need to find. So this display is actually not informative concerning grammatical gender. However, imagine that instead of showing you two pictures that are feminine, now I show you a picture that is feminine, pelota, and a picture that is masculine, carro. And now I tell you, find the, and this is feminine. Well, if you know something about the grammar of Spanish, your eyes will look at, or the prediction is that your eyes will look at pelota because it is the only item that matches in gender with the article. And so what you would expect is anticipatory looks to pelota when the display has different, a picture that is feminine in gender and a picture that is masculine in gender. And so the question that researchers have posed is, do native speakers of Spanish, in fact, use gender information encoded in articles to anticipate what object they're supposed to look at? And the answer is yes. And so what I'm showing here is data from adults and data from children. What this little, what I'm plotting here, or what was plotted here, is the proportion of looks to the object that was spoken in the sentence. And the dark dot are items in which there was different gender, so one was masculine, one was feminine, and the one with the white dot is items in which you have same gender. These are adults, these are children. Before I go into the graph, what's clear is that adults and children are doing more or less the same thing. It's just that children are a bit slower, all right, which is expected. But the important finding is this, that when the gender is different, so when you have a picture of the ball and the car, participants orient their looks to the ball sooner than they orient their look to car, okay? So this happens here in time, this happens here in time, suggesting that in fact, native Spanish speakers use grammatical gender information to anticipate that the following noun will be either masculine or feminine. All right. And so what we did was, given this fact, we wanted to actually look at what Spanish-English bilinguals do when they are exposed to a source of variation in this particular grammatical rule. And so the source of variation is speech while bilinguals code switch, and code switching is a particular form of bilingual speech that is characterized by a smooth alternation between two languages in bilingual discourse. Not all bilinguals code switch, and what I want to do now is just give you a feel for a real bilingual person code switching, and then I'll explain to you what the study was about. So this data, this recording comes from Spanish-English bilinguals who were recorded in Miami, Florida, and the researchers basically put a recorder on a table and told them, speak whatever you want for half an hour. And they were not told to code switch, but because they're bilinguals and they're in Miami, they actually do code switch, and this is what they said. And I just want you to hear, that way you can get a feel for how smooth the alternation is, although I'm sure that many of the people sitting in the audience actually code switch, and this is just something that they know very well.
I'm just going to go, pero que tengo que esperar a coger el dinero ese mayo. ¿Qué dinero? El dinero ese que me van a dar los taxes. Oh, okay. And I'm still 4 months ahead. Yeah. I mean, how much, it'll probably go up, yeah, in the second month to the first. ¿Tengo de cabeza? What did you eat yesterday? I went to Publix yesterday.
All right, so not all the translation is there, but you can hear, especially when the bilingual, when the person says, what did you eat yesterday que te cayó mal? Where in fact, you can hear that there are two languages being mixed right there. All right, so what we did was we capitalized on something that happens when Spanish-English bilinguals code switch, and some variation of the gender rule that I told you earlier. So what we have observed by looking at many, many hours of corpus data is that when proficient Spanish-English bilinguals are code switching, the masculine determiner el, which means the masculine, can be used with an English noun whose Spanish translation equivalent is either masculine or feminine. And let me give you an example. So we see very often in corpus people speaking phrases like el fork and el spoon. And there are people laughing because, yes, we all do this. And so notice that the translation equivalent for the word fork in Spanish is el tenedor, and so it's a masculine word, whereas the translation equivalent of spoon, la cuchara, is feminine. Despite that, the masculine article is used. So if you think about the idea that perhaps what bilinguals are doing are matching gender, well, this is a violation of the rule because you have a masculine article and a feminine, and the translation equivalent of a feminine word. That's for masculine. For feminine, though, that's not the way it works. So the feminine determiner la, also meaning the, appears only with feminine translation equivalents. So you will hear people say la spoon, You will hear people say la blender, and these are in fact extracted from real speech of bilinguals, but you will never hear a mismatch in gender when la is present. So you will never hear la candy. Candy is caramelo, and you won't hear la, well, I even have trouble translating that one. Fork is, thank you. La fork, el tenedor. Okay, so there is an asymmetry in how the gender is being used in code switch speech, because there is not a one-to-one match between the grammatical gender of the article and the gender of the noun. So the question that we asked was this. It was a wild question, very wild. We asked, could it be the case, is it the case that native Spanish speakers who, again, know very well the rules of Spanish, when they're exposed to code switching, and when they're exposed to these types of so-called violations of the grammar of the Spanish, of the rules of Spanish, is it possible that it affects the way they process Spanish gender? All right, that was the question that we wanted to ask. And so the question again is, are Spanish-English bilinguals who code switch tuned to the el, la plus English noun asymmetry in code switching production, and do they use this information during the comprehension of Spanish phrases? And the answer is yes. Okay, so what I'm showing here is a graph that is very similar to the graph I showed you earlier with the kids, the black and white graph. Again, the experiment was the same type of experiment in which participants heard a phrase, encuentra la, find the, and they saw either a cookie and a ball, or both feminine, or a cookie and a car, so feminine and masculine. And again, what we care about is when you have the feminine and masculine in front of you, because that's the case, that's the only case in which you'll be able to anticipate what noun the speaker wants you to look at based on the gender of the article. All right, so what I'm showing here is the Spanish monolinguals, because it was important for us to make sure that we had a baseline in which the monolingual Spanish speakers were behaving the way we thought they should. And what you see is that, so the Spanish monolinguals in the feminine different display, well, they look at the target item very quickly, okay? And they don't even consider the other picture at all. When you have masculine different gender, so when in fact the target is not now ball, but it's car, which is the masculine target, you basically see the same result. So they're able to anticipate the words pelota or carro based on whether what comes before is el or la. All right. Now, what do the code switchers do? Now, remember, the code switchers are processing in Spanish. They are hearing in Spanish. They're not hearing code switch sentences. But they are code switchers themselves. With the feminine, you basically find the same result as with the monolinguals. With the masculine, they are looking at the two pictures. All right? So when they hear el and they see a picture of a masculine noun and a feminine noun, they wait until they can actually hear the beginning of the noun before they launch their looks to the actual target. And so what you see is they go back and forth between the two pictures until they hear the noun, indicating, remarkably, that being exposed to code switch speech has changed the way in which they are processing gender in Spanish, which is their native language. All right. Now, these are people, of course. This data was collected with code switchers who were part of a code switching community in New York, where there are lots of Puerto Rican speakers and Dominican speakers who are code switchers. And so, oops, sorry. So I've talked about two studies that show that being exposed in the natural environment to another type of input that is not necessarily your native language input actually changes the way your native language is processed. So the next question that we had was, well, how long does it really take for these changes to show up in the native language? And most of the bilinguals that we've tested have been immersed in either an English environment in the first experiment or in a code switching environment for a very long time in the second experiment. And we wanted to find out how long it really takes to do this. So is it the case that only when you are immersed in the L2 for an extended period of time you see the changes, or can you see the changes when things happen in a very short period of time? So what we did was we used again the relative clause ambiguity resolution structure. So this is the sentence. This is the structure where the hairdresser, the friend of the hairdresser who was Greek. We went back to that particular structure because we know a lot about how that's processed in Spanish. All right, so what we did was we gathered Spanish-English bilinguals in the US, and we pre-tested them on this structure. So we brought them in the lab, and we tried to figure out whether they are high attachers, so people that actually process the structure as native Spanish speakers do, or low attachers. So these would be people that process the structure as native English speakers do. So once we figure out whether they are high attachers or low attachers, we assign them to a treatment group. The high attachers read sentences that favor the opposite attachment that they were used to engaging in. So the high attachers read sentences that were disambiguated in favor of low attachment, of the opposite attachment. And the low attachers, people that do what English normally does, read sentences that were disambiguated in favor of high attachment. All right? Now, and these bilinguals receive the treatment either in Spanish or in English. Okay? All right. Oops. We also, so they received the treatment in Spanish or in English, and basically the treatment was administered through about the course of a week. They read about 120 sentences total. Then we pretested them again in these structures here. So we pretested them to see whether the people who actually prefer to do low attachment changed to high attachment, and the people that prefer to do high attachment changed to low attachment. Okay, that's what we really wanted to find out. What I'm showing you here are the results. Don't worry too much about what all those lines mean. I'll walk you through how it is that you need to read these graphs. So the red represents the low attachment structures. The blue represents the high, the red represents the high attachment structures. The blue represents the low attachment structures. And these are the high attachers group. So these are people that prefer to interpret amigo, griego, to refer to amigo. And what we want to see is, do they change? So that now griego gets interpreted to be referring to peluquera. And what you see is that pretest, the high attachment group favor high attachment sentences. So what this means, what you see in this graph is what's lower, it's easier, higher is harder, okay? And so at pretest, they were high attachers, and yes, this shows that they were high attachers. 1 week later, we brought them to the lab and tested them again in their comprehension, and what you see is that they began to change, all right? So exposing them to sentences that were opposite to the sentences that they typically favor when they process Spanish ended up changing the way they process Spanish. A week later, you see they actually switched preferences, where now the sentences that they first favor, now they disfavor. See, this is lower, this is higher than this, and the sentences that they disfavored, they now favored. So what it seems to be happening is that being exposed to for a very short period of time to input that does not favor what they normally would actually changes the way they're processing language. And we find a similar result for the other group, okay? All right. So in short, what we find is that participants who originally preferred to process in one particular way after being exposed to sentences that favored the other way ended up favoring that processing strategy, and vice versa for the other group. And so being bilingual then is not only about acquiring and using a second language, but also about the ways in which the native or dominant language changes in response to the input that speakers receive. So what we see is that when proficient bilinguals are immersed in the L2 environment, even for a very short period of time, the L1 is affected. And I'm going to borrow a line from my colleague Judy Kroll, and there is a study, there is an important researcher from François Grosjean who once published a paper saying, neurolinguists, be aware, the bilingual is not two monolinguals in one person. And in fact, this is what it seems that this is the conclusion that we're reaching here. And what we see is that not only was Grosjean right, the recent evidence in fact suggests that once you speak a second language, once you learn a second language, or you are exposed to a different type of environment, you are never the same in your native language. But this is not bad, all right? So, and this is why the title of the talk is, it changes your native language in good ways, but what it shows is that the native language is open to, the language system in general is very plastic. So it's open to changes from the second language, and in fact, it shows something that we didn't know about how cognition actually, about the architecture of the language system. And so this is a special type of tuning that is fundamental to all speakers. So this is not just about native speakers or bilinguals. All speakers are open to this influence, and how it gets deployed may be a function of the speaker's experiences. So what I want to do now is switch and leave the topic of the influence of the L2 on the L1 for a second and illustrate this particular tuning that we see in bilingual speakers using code switching, all right? Because given the context here, it seems important to talk about code switching and what a special ability that is. And despite the fact that many people think that code switching is a sign of bilingualism or a sign that people don't speak two languages well, what linguistic research shows is that in fact code switching is a very high level task that only bilinguals who are highly proficient can actually engage in. So we know, for example, that code switching is not random, but actually follows particular types of rules, and linguists fight about what those rules are. And we know that it's community based. So not all bilinguals who speak two languages code switch, all right? So it's something that you learn by being surrounded with a community. So what I want to show is that, what I want to illustrate with some of the newer work that we're doing in the lab is how it is that linguistic experience affects bilinguals by illustrating it with code switching. So we know that bilinguals vary in their linguistic experience with respect to how, when, and where they use their two languages. So what I wanted to, I already talked to you about the fact that bilinguals, that code switching is not that code switching is systematic and that emerges only in some bilingual communities. So in this next set of studies, I want to illustrate this tuning that happens when bilinguals are exposed to code switching, and how, and illustrate how exquisite the comprehension system is tuned to what happens in production, to what happens in the environment. And I want to go back to the gender congruency that I spoke to you about a minute ago, where, just to remind you, the Spanish, the masculine article el can be used with English nouns whose Spanish translation equivalents are masculine or feminine, but la can only be used with translation equivalents that are feminine, which is illustrated right here. So el can be used with fork and spoon, and obviously with tenedor, which is the Spanish word, but la is used with the Spanish word, and to a lesser extent with spoon. All right. So in this particular study, what we really wanted to look at was, we've seen studies that look at behavior, and we've seen that, in fact, bilinguals are sensitive to this type of asymmetries. The question that we had was, is the brain, does the brain tune to this type of asymmetries? And we wanted to see if what happened, what were the brain responses when bilinguals who code switch were exposed to the things that they do, and when bilinguals who don't code switch were exposed to things that they don't do. So in this particular study, we recorded brain activity, brain potentials, of a group of Spanish-English bilinguals in the US who code switch, and we compared their brain responses with Spanish-English bilinguals in Spain who don't code switch, all right? And we showed them a contextual sentence. So the translation of the sentences are right here. Juan is setting the table before the invited guests arrived. Notice that the contextual sentence had in itself a code switch that also occurs very frequent in bilingual discourse. But what's important here is what it is that bilinguals do when they continue reading in Spanish and now they see the noun un fork. All right? And this is what we found. These lines represent brainwaves, and you don't have to necessarily worry about what those brainwaves are. What matters here is what the non-code switchers do. So these are Spanish-English bilinguals in Spain who were matched in proficiency with the code switchers in the US. So what we care about is what is it that they're doing. And remember that these code switchers speak the same two languages as these code switchers. Their difference is that they are exposed to code switching and switch, but these people don't. And so finding a differences between between these two groups would tell us that what the linguistic system is doing is tuning into code switching, and the differences can be about how the two languages interact, because they speak exactly the same language. And what you find is that when they are processing un fork versus una fork, and remember una fork is the type of code switch that we never find in bilingual speech, the non-code switchers basically don't show a difference. Whereas the code switchers, for the code switchers, processing una fork is difficult, okay? Processing what they don't see in code switching is hard relative to processing what they see in code switching. We also decided to compare what happened when we compared a code switch with simply a unilingual phrase. And what you find is that when the non-code switchers had difficulty processing un fork right here, whereas the code switchers, for them, processing un tenedor or un fork is exactly the same. So you see the lines overlap. For them, processing something that is code switched or something that is completely unilingual doesn't really matter, doesn't affect their system. And so what we're showing is that these bilinguals are tuning to language in their environment, and that this tuning is reflected in how it is that are comprehending, how their brain is processing language. So they process familiar structures with more ease relative to unfamiliar structures. And the last study I want to talk to you about is a similar study, again, looking at Spanish-English bilinguals, looking at code switching, but now looking at a different structure, because what we wanted to see was whether the results that we can find with gender are found with other types of structures. So when we look at Spanish-English bilingual corpus, we find that these types of code switches, so switches that involve the verb estar plus an English participle, are quite frequent. So saying things like, los niños están cleaning their rooms, typically occurs as frequently in code switching and bilingual corpus as los niños are cleaning their rooms. So switching here is just as frequent as switching right here. But los niños uncleaned their rooms with this particular structure, haber, and then an English verb, actually occurs less frequently than los niños have cleaned their rooms. So again, we have an asymmetry in which some structures are preferred in bilingual speech. These bilinguals produce these structures, and some are not. And what we want, and what I'm showing you here are actual recordings, the transcriptions of recordings of people, real people speaking these sentences. So, mi marido está working on his master's, ¿dónde estás teaching? Siempre está promising cosas, yo creo que apenas se había washed out. All of these sentences are actual sentences that bilinguals have produced, and they basically illustrate the propensity of switching, the frequency with which switches happen at this site compared to switches that happen at this site. All right, so what we wanted to see was, well, this is what bilinguals do when they're speaking to other bilinguals. Is their comprehension system tuned to these differences so that when they are hearing, I'm sorry. So that when they're hearing, okay, I know how to use this. Okay, all right. So when they're hearing this, or when they're reading these sentences, they're actually sensitive to these types of asymmetries. And so what we did in this particular study is we had bilinguals read sentences in 4 conditions. A condition in which the code switch happened at the verb to be, a condition in which the code switch happened at the participle, at this verb, and remember that these 2 occur frequently in the environment, so the prediction would be that they should be just as easy to process. And then we had them read sentences such as these, where the code switch occurred at the verb, at the have, and where the code switch occurred at rehearsed. And the prediction here was that if they tune to what happens in their environment, this should be easy and this should be hard. And we recorded eye movements while bilinguals read these sentences. I've already talked to you about what the predictions are, and here are the results. And so I'm only showing one type of measure here, but these are the progressive structures. So what I'm representing is reading times or fixation durations at the progressive structure. Those are the estar structures. And at the perfect structures, those are the haber structures. And these are switches at the auxiliary. So are rehearsing, están rehearsing, have rehearsed, and rehearsed. And what you see is that what we see is that there was not a significant difference between reading times at the progressive structure, but when the switch was an rehearsed switch, bilinguals took much longer to read that switch than to read the have rehearsed type of switch. Again, showing that they are sensitive to what happens in their environment. And so it's almost time to finish, so I'm going to move on to my concluding remarks. So what I've tried to show here is that bilinguals are sensitive to the distributional patterns that are in their environment when other people are speaking. And what they do is use this information to guide their comprehension processes. And so speakers' production create these distributional patterns, so these asymmetries that I've talked to you about, and what these distributional patterns do is they become probabilistic constraints that guide the comprehension system. And, oh darn. So comprehenders implicitly learn these patterns and interpret this new input as consistent with previous input, which is a mechanism that explains why it is that you see changes from the L2 into the L1, which is why you see why that bilinguals are actually, dancing with language. And so the comprehension system then can become tuned to distributional information in the input, and this fine-tuning could shed light on how bilinguals regulate their two languages in their daily lives. So what I've tried to do here is exploit the power of the unique linguistic environment in which bilinguals find themselves to reveal the central influences that production has on comprehension and on linguistic representations. And the big lesson here is that these results require a revision of the traditional story about language development, about the ideas that you cannot learn a second language well after the critical period, because in fact what you will see is that that's not the case, that people actually are able to become proficient in a second language. Not only that, the system is so open to influence from the second language that you actually see changes in the first language. And you wouldn't expect to see this if there were hard constraints on when and how languages are acquired. And with that, I thank you very much. So we have times for questions. Yes.
Are you aware of any studies that have been done with sign language, and are there any distinctives to this research?
Yeah, this is interesting. There have been studies that have looked at two types of bilinguals. So L1 signers of ASL that look at, that actually have learned English as a second language, but also bimodal bilinguals. And studies haven't really looked at code switching at this level with either of those two populations. But what I can tell you, which is still very exciting results, is that we still see influence of the L2 on the L1. And so signs that are similar, that have particular phonological properties, if you will, to the second language, end up actually facilitating processing in sign, so or in the second language. So we still see influence of the L1, of the L2 on the L1, even when the two modes of the two languages are actually have completely different structures, but also completely different modes. But again, those studies have not looked at these types of more the type of structures and code switches that I've seen here, but you still see influence of the languages there. Yeah. Yes?
I do have a question. I do code switching all the time. And so I never do the code switching with the perfect tenses, but I do often do the code switching with the IM form, the present progressive.
Right.
Did you find out if it was a matter of the foundation of this preference? Is it based on phonetic? Or what is the basis of it?
Yeah. And and people debate on what it is. So the question you're asking is what determines how production happens. Right.
The perfect tense for me is quite difficult to make the sound phonetically.
All right.
But the ing form is
Very easy, right. So what people haven't really looked at that question in terms of phonetic, but people have come up with syntactic explanations for it. So the idea is that in Spanish, the perfect form, so the haber, ha ido, has gone, actually acts as a unit. And in fact, if you think about it, in Spanish, you cannot insert anything in the middle. Whereas in Spanish, you can, the to be form and the ing form can be separated. So you can say things like, está siempre fastidiándome. So he's always bothering me. So they are not necessarily a unit. And the idea is that because they don't work always as a unit, you can split them, you can actually switch. Whereas when the two, that's one potential explanation. Whereas in some varieties of Spanish, so for example in Peninsular Spanish, there is no other way to say, I took a shower yesterday than to say, I he ido, or you can't split those two things anymore. And so that's the basic explanation, that things that work as chunks, it's not that they cannot be separated, but it's harder to split them. Whereas things that work, that are not real chunks, can be split, and then switch seems to be easier in those areas. Yes?
When you talked about the code switching and the congruency, can you say that the incongruency with switching to things that are feminine, that would be a reanalysis of how we see gender, because in English there is no gender, so we see that same determinant of everything?
Or that perhaps what's happening here is that in Spanish, el is actually a default. And so when you have a word that doesn't have gender, well, I'm just going to use el. And in fact, if you look at Spanish historically, Spanish borrowed many words from Greek that ended in an a. Problema, for example, is a Greek word. Planeta is a Greek word that ends in a, but they were borrowed with the el. So we say el problema, el planeta. And so that more or less gives us the insight that el is perhaps a default article, and that what's happening with these code switches is that most of the time we just use the default because it's easy. But when you use la, you better think about what you're doing, because la is not a default article. Yeah. Brenda.
So I thought that the study where subjects were actually changing their preferences when it came to the high attachment, low attachment was pretty fascinating. And it actually reminded me, because it had to do with ambiguous relative clauses with a disambiguation built in, it reminded me of the Novik-Su study a bit, in which, for those of you who don't know it, you're presented with a screen, and then there are images on the screen, like say a frog and a napkin and a plate. And maybe you're just told, put the frog on the napkin, and you do that. You drag on the screen the frog onto the napkin. But if there's a frog, a napkin, and a plate, and you hear a sentence like, put the frog on the napkin onto the plate, people get a little confused and will immediately try to put the frog on the napkin, because that's what they hear first. Put the frog on the napkin, and then onto the plate. That confuses them. I suspect that if the study were run with the same subjects after a week and after 2 weeks, they might catch on to the trick. And
right.
They might be primed for it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I know what you're doing. So is
Yeah.
there any chance that in your study, people were kind of primed by the earlier experience?
Yes, and it's a question that I get often. So what's happened? So people say, well, what's happening is you're getting priming, and my response is yes, but priming is really a learning, and it depends on what your story about what priming is. Whether you think priming is a transient type of effect, or whether you think that priming is actually something that helps people learn. So it involves implicit learning. And so I think I think the story of priming is very consistent with the idea that input is the input around you is changing the way you're processing things. It is a mechanism whereby those things happen, and whether or not the processing system ends up changing is really a question about how much of this you are involved in. So I suspect that if I took participants out of this context, and they never, ever were exposed to this again, I don't expect there to be learning that continues, because the input is very poor, in a sense. But yes, I mean, yes, is there priming? I think there is. And is it inconsistent with the results that you can change your L1? Not really, because it's a mechanism by which change and learning can happen. Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. Yeah, and there are, we haven't worked on trilinguals in our lab, but there is a lot of research that is beginning to emerge on trilinguals. There are also studies that look at bilinguals learning an artificial language that also seem to show really interesting results that are congenial with the idea that there is not necessarily a critical period for learning a second language, but that there are a variety of different types of constraints that might make learning a second language difficult. Yeah. Yeah.
I have what could be an odd question. You will tell me if it is or not. Could code switching tell us anything about the level of proficiency that the speaker has in the language?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there is work by Shanna Poplak, and this is a researcher from Canada who did a lot of work with bilinguals in New York. And she recorded bilinguals with different levels of proficiency. What she found was that bilinguals who were less proficient in one of the languages code switched, but the type of code switch they did was not the type of code switch that I showed in these slides. So their code switching was characterized by tag switching. So things like, I need to get, I don't like this lecture. This lecture was very boring, ¿verdad? So that type of switching. Or perhaps switches across sentences, which, saying a sentence completely in Spanish, saying a sentence completely in English. But the type of, what she showed in her study, which has been confirmed in later studies, is that bilinguals who do the types of switches that I just showed, so the star types of switches, está going, or the L fork and L spoon types of switches, are bilinguals that actually, they have to be very proficient in the two languages, because it's not random. There are some things that you'll never see in particular types of code switching communities, and things that you see across all of the communities. So what the research actually shows is opposite to what most people think. Most people think that code switching is a sign of a lingualism. You don't know either language. And what the research shows is that, in fact, only when you are highly proficient in the two languages can you navigate back and forth in a way that is very smooth and grammatical.
But at the same time, I also imagine that it creates conflict, constant conflict, right?
Yeah, and this is actually the case even if you don't code switch. So the research shows that, in fact, the bilinguals are constantly juggling the two languages, because now I'm speaking English and I have to make absolutely sure that Spanish doesn't come out. And there are conflicts, especially when the two languages are different. There are conflicts that have to be resolved all the time. And so it is not unique of bilinguals who code switch. The conflict exists even when bilinguals don't code switch. And at least this is what the research shows, that there is this back and forth juggling that has to happen for people to be able to speak one language and not allow the other one to come out.
Julie, maybe take one more question.
All right. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. So I have a question because you've mentioned that there's no critical period, right? And I tend to believe that, so I'm with you. But coming from the SLA field, there are colleagues, right, who would push against that, especially because you're basing your claims on brain data, right? So we know that sometimes brain and behavioral data don't
don't match.
So how would you respond to that? To people say, well, in the brain, yeah, we're seeing these signatures, right, that are native-like, but in the behavior of data,
we don't see it. Right, and in fact, it is the complaint that many language teachers, so when I give these talks to language teachers, they say, but I mean, I've taught to my students the subjunctive 1,000 times. And you know, they graduate with a Spanish major, they cannot use the subjunctive. and so the response there, I mean, my view is that behavior lags behind. And behavior lags quite a bit, sometimes can lag quite a bit behind. But if what you begin to see is that the brain begins to change, what this tells us is that the brain is open to the different types of linguistic input, to the different types of, and is noticing that input and those differences in the environment. And I think, in fact, it is thanks to the brain data that now the stories that we used to believe were absolutely true need to be modulated. I'm not saying, I'm not saying, well, throw everything, throw the baby and the bathwater out. What I'm saying is, it's not as simple as there is a critical period and that's the end of the story. And then you want to learn a second language, well, good luck to you. And so the brain data now and the new imaging data is actually opening up a new hypothesis about what it is that is really happening. And the idea that the brain doesn't stop learning, that there is learning at different levels, and who achieves what may have to do with other factors, may have to do with other types of differences that mark different types of individuals.
I'd like to thank Giuli for a very provocative talk.
Thank you.